I was thinking of a story that I heard from a missionary about a shepherd and about sheep. And I thought, I got to share that this morning. I just think it's so fitting. It's about a missionary from Africa. And he talked about his life in Africa. And he told how the people of a village knew each other's sheep the way that we might know one another's children. As he sat in a group in the village, a person would stop by. "Have you seen my sheep today? My sheep so-and-so," identifying his own sheep by name. Through the dark night, he heard villages calling out names. "They're calling their sheep," one of the locals told him. "They will all find each other." Now, this feature of village life, he said, in a small enough and close enough place where folks know which sheep are theirs and which belong to someone else, where sheep themselves know to whom they belong, was as familiar to Jesus as it is unfamiliar to us. In this passage, this portion of John 10, as Jesus tries to describe the connection between himself and his followers, he uses images that don't touch our hearts and minds as richly as they would have touched his original hearers. My heart and my mind were touched this morning as one of his sheep, even as John prayed. And that's the connection, I think, that these sheep had with their shepherd. And that's the connection that Jesus has with his children, with his people. It says in this passage that his sheep hear his voice, and they know him, and they follow him. And the yearning of my heart is to be one of those sheep that follows him, that recognizes his voice. That still small voice that speaks to our heart, right? That still small voice, that quiet voice that speaks to our hearts. Now, if we look at the two sets of images that are here in this text, in John 10 and verses 1 through 5, Jesus simply speaks a truth that his hearers would have known and relied upon, like the folks in the African village. The first century Judeans also highly valued their sheep, and they knew them intimately. We can observe a couple of interesting things here about the shepherd with whom Jesus identifies himself. First, this shepherd has the well-being of the sheep at heart. And that's always foremost in God's mind and in God's heart. As we've said here so many times over the years, the reality is that for us, it needs to be all about God, right? But here's the truth for us that we take great comfort from this morning as his children, hopefully as one of his sheep who recognizes his voice. We take comfort in knowing that to God, it's all about us. Can you believe that? Can you grasp that? To God, it's all about us. It's all about you. It's all about me. That's how we are loved. We are his beloved children. My beloved son, my beloved daughter, in whom I am well pleased. On Sunday evenings in our recovery service, we've spent a lot of years together in that service trying to get people to undergird their faith, their recovery program, their spirituality with the knowledge that they are so loved by God, that there isn't anything they can ever do to get God to stop loving them. Now, you know, I've always wanted to be this kind of a shepherd. I've fallen short in many, many ways, but I guess that's the yearning of our heart, right? And what God sees is the yearning of our heart, the intention of our heart. God doesn't focus on our failures, on all the times we've fallen flat on our face. 1 Corinthians 13 says, he keeps no record of wrongs, folks. He doesn't have a big long list. When I was new in my faith, I had people that were telling me that there was going to be a big screen someday just big like this one back here, bigger. And that all my sins were going to be listed up there. And I said, but what hope is there then for anybody? Well, you know what you have to understand is that God forgives you. And over the years, I've started to realize, instead of focusing so much on that big screen with all of my sins listed, how about I focus on Easter and on Jesus taking all my sins, all my shame, all my guilt upon himself on the cross, so that I don't have to carry that anymore. So I don't have to spend my whole life thinking that there's going to be a big screen someday, and there they are, all the things, pictures, images. I can't remember the name of the movie, but there was a movie like that years ago. And they died and supposedly were in purgatory, halfway between heaven and hell. And they looked at all these things that they had done wrong, right? And I thought, wouldn't it be awful? But that's not God's love. That's not God's forgiveness that we find in Jesus Christ. That's not the Good Shepherd. That's not the image we see in him. We observe some of these amazing things about the shepherd with whom Jesus identified himself. First of all, this shepherd has the well-being of the sheep at heart rather than his own well-being. To the shepherd, it's all about the sheep. Right? To the shepherd, it's all about the sheep. There's a relationship here of trust among everyone that's involved, right? Notice that the sheep are not presented as totally dumb. They hear, they follow, they flee false shepherds and are able to know whom to trust. And the image a lot of times, and I've had people say that to me, well, I'm not a sheep. I don't want to be thought of as a sheep. You know, sheep are dumb, right? They're not so dumb, right? Jesus is saying that they can hear his voice. They hear God's voice. They follow. They flee the false shepherds and are able to know whom to trust. So in verse 4 here in this passage, their trust is validated and emphasized by another piece of the shepherd's behavior. He brings the sheep out of the fold and then goes before them. He goes before them. And there's a reason for that. That the shepherd might protect the sheep, right? That the shepherd might be sure that the pathway is safe, right? And the sheep follow him, right? They hear his voice. He goes before them, and they follow him. So the sheep do not simply escape some confinement or hasten out of the fold to brave the larger world on their own. Their shepherd leads them out and then goes before them, in front of them, to lead. They're not abandoned. They're not abandoned. Wow. That's the amazing thing that we hang on to here with our shepherd. He will never leave us or forsake us. This is such a beloved picture. And I think that's why John captured my own heart this morning. The Spirit captured my heart through John's beautiful prayer. There's no better loved picture of Jesus than the picture of the Good Shepherd. Years ago, when I was a student minister, Marilyn and I went down to Portland, Oregon, to check out a graduate school down there that I really wanted to go to. Some of my friends had gone to. And I found a picture in a big Christian bookstore down in Portland. And it's a picture, I still have it. It's been on my wall in my office from the beginning of my ministry, from my first pastorate, right? It's a picture of the Good Shepherd, right? I think I showed it to you one time on another message that we shared. We talked about the Good Shepherd. And it's a picture of Jesus, right? I think it was the 90 and 9 that I showed you that picture. And Jesus is carrying that little lamb on his shoulders, right? And all the other sheep are following, right? He's right in the middle of them. And I've kept that right by my door. So when I come out of my office, I try to remember to look at that picture and ask God to help me to be that shepherd, that good shepherd, that pastor, right? Because that's what shepherd means in Latin. It means pastor. A shepherd's life was hard. The shepherd's task was not only constant, but dangerous. For in addition, he had to guard the flock against wild animals, especially against wolves. And there were always thieves and robbers ready to steal the sheep. So constant vigilance, fearless courage, patient love for his flock were the necessary characteristics of the shepherd. Now, in the Old Testament, God is often pictured as the shepherd and the people as his flock, as John shared with us from Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Then he says in Psalm 77, thou didst lead the people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. We, thy people, the flock of thy pasture, will give thanks to thee forever, in Psalm 79. Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, thou who leadest the sheep of his hand. And then we are his people and the sheep of his pasture in Psalm 100. God's anointed one, the Messiah, is also pictured as the shepherd of the sheep. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms and will carry them into his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. He will be shepherding the flock of the Lord faithfully and righteously and will suffer none of them to stumble in their pasture. He will lead them. The leaders of the people are described as the shepherds of God, of God's people and the nation. Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. Woe to that shepherd, right? The picture passes over into the New Testament from the Old Testament scripture. Jesus is the good shepherd. He's the shepherd who will risk his life to seek and to save one straying sheep, right? Wow. Just as in the Old Testament picture, the leaders of the church are the shepherds and they're the people, and the people are the flock. It's the duty of the leader to feed the flock of God, to accept the oversight willingly and not by constraint, to do it eagerly and not for the love of money, not to use the position for the exercise of power, and to be an example to the flock. Paul urges the elders of Ephesus to take heed to all the flock over which the Holy Spirit had made them overseers. It is Jesus' last command to Peter that he should feed his lambs and his sheep. Feed my lambs, feed my sheep. Now the Jews, they had a lovely legend to explain why God chose Moses. And I love this. It just fits so beautifully with our message today. God chose Moses to be the leader of his people, according to this Jewish legend. When Moses was feeding the sheep of his father-in-law in the wilderness, a young little kid, young little goat, a sheep, ran away. Moses followed it until it reached a ravine where it found a well to drink from. When Moses got up, when he got up to it, he said, I did not know that you ran away because you were thirsty. Now you must be weary. And he took the little lamb on his shoulders and he carried it back to the flock. Then God said in this beautiful legend, because you have shown pity in leading back one of a flock belonging to a man, you shall lead my flock, Israel. Wow. You know, this word shepherd brings with it a tall order, right? It's a big job. Wow. It should paint a picture to us I think the shepherd, the pastor, of a picture that's hard to live up to, that's impossible to live up to in and of our own abilities and our own strengths. It's a picture that I think is painted of the unceasing vigilance and patience of the unconditional love of God, right? Wow, it never stops, and there isn't anything that can ever stop it. The scripture says nothing in all creation can ever separate us from the love of God. That's the power of God's love for you and for me. That's the power of the Good Shepherd, right? That embraces us today. Wow, it paints a picture to me of that unceasing vigilance and patience of the love of God, and it needs to remind us of our duty towards our brothers and sisters, towards the world in which God has placed us, especially if we hold any kind of leadership in the church, right? We need to take that seriously, and we need to be patterned after the Good Shepherd in our humility. Wow. At the end of the day, when the sheep were going into the fold, the shepherd would hold his rod across the entrance, quite close to the ground, and every sheep had to pass under it. And it tells us that as each sheep passed under it, the shepherd quickly examined it. This was his way of examining it, to make sure it was okay, to see if it had received any kind of injury throughout the day, to just gently check it and see that it was well. This relationship between the sheep and shepherd, it's a different relationship in Palestine than, for instance, in Britain. When they're thinking of the sheep, they're thinking of mutton, right? The Palestinian shepherd wasn't thinking of eating that sheep, right? He was thinking of the wool. Whole different ball game, right? The sheep and the shepherd are quite different in Britain and Palestine. In Britain, the sheep is largely kept for slaughter, but in Palestine, largely for their wool. So it happens that in Palestine, the sheep are often with the shepherd for years and years, right? And often they have names by which the shepherd calls them. Usually these names are descriptive. For instance, brown leg or black ear. In Palestine, the shepherd went in front and the sheep followed. The shepherd went first to see that the path was safe, and sometimes the sheep had to be encouraged to follow. The shepherd sometimes ended up carrying the lambs. When its mother saw her lamb on the other side, actually to get the sheep to follow, the shepherd would sometimes pick up the little lamb and then walk ahead. And the mother would see the little lamb with the shepherd and say, well, I've got to be with my little one, right? And then that mother would follow, and then the rest of the sheep would follow behind. Wow. What an image it is for us this morning. One of the great scholars of the scriptures, the New Testament, Old Testament scriptures, but especially I remember the book In the Steps of the Master by H.V. Morton. And he has a wonderful description of the way in which the shepherd talks to the sheep. Sometimes he talks to them in a loud, sing-song voice, using a weird language, unlike anything, he said, I've ever heard in my life. The first time I heard the sheep and goat language, I was on the hills at the back of Jericho. A goat herd had descended into a valley and was mounting the slope of an opposite hill. When turning round, he saw his goats had remained behind to devour a rich patch of scrub. Lifting his voice, he spoke to the goats in a language that Pan must have spoken to the mountains of Greece. It was uncanny because there was nothing human about it. The words were animal sounds, arranged in a kind of order. No sooner had he spoken than an answering bleat shivered over the herd, and one or two of the animals turned their heads in his direction, but they did not obey him. Then he says, the goat herd then called out one word and gave a laughing kind of whinny. Immediately a goat with a bell around its neck stopped eating, and leaving the herd, trotted down the hill across the valley and up the opposite slopes. The man, accompanied by this animal, walked on and disappeared around the ledge of rock. Very soon a panic spread among the herd. They forgot to eat. They looked up for the shepherd. He was not to be seen. They became conscious that the leader with the bell at his neck was no longer with them. From the distance came the strange laughing call of the shepherd, and at the sound of it, the entire herd stampeded into the hollow and leapt up the hill after him. Well, the shepherd calls sharply from time to time to remind them of his presence. They know his voice and follow on. But if a stranger call, they stop short. They lift up their heads in alarm. And if it is repeated, they turn and they flee, because they know not the voice of a stranger. He says, I have made the experiment repeatedly. And that's exactly the picture that John gives us here. The sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. Do you listen for the voice of God? Are you listening this morning for that still small voice? This passage finishes with a great verse, John chapter 10 and verse 10. It's been a favorite of mine for years, and I guess really the bottom line for this verse is the rest of this passage that we've read this morning. Jesus says, I am come that you might have life, and that you might have it more abundantly. Not that you might just live, but that you might have abundant life. Life that's overflowing, right? And that comes to a listening heart. To a heart that quiets itself before God, right? And listens to the Spirit. And then we find that peace that passes all human understanding, because we recognize things are in the proper order and we're following our shepherd.